Thank you. I do think we're ready to begin. So Professor Hehir and Professor Stein will be the moderators and discussants. And we'd like to welcome our distinguished panelists so that Tom Hehir and Michael will introduce each one of them one at a time. And it's time to begin. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Again, we have a great panel here today, and each of them are going to speak for about 8 minutes. I'll introduce the three I'm supposed to introduce, and Michael, you can do yours. The first person I'd like to introduce is the second person over, Todd Grindal. Todd is a former student of mine. I'm very proud of him. You may recognize him in a book that you might read. Todd is out dyslexic, and he has a doctorate from Harvard. I have done one of the things that, so many things I could say about Todd, and I don't want to make these really long introductions. Other than has dedicated his great intellectual talents to making the world a better place at Abt Associates. We just finished a research synthesis looking at inclusive education worldwide, the first one really ever done on inclusive education, in which we synthesized 250 studies that have been conducted worldwide on inclusive education for a foundation in Brazil that are promoting the interest of people with Down syndrome. Todd has done a number of other studies. Some we've done together, some he's done independently. His primary interest is really not disability, but is really very young children. And he just is an amazing researcher and an out dyslexic. So welcome, Todd. Bill Henderson is a long-time friend. We've known each other for a very long time. We used to work in the Boston Public Schools together. Years ago, Bill is the former principal of the Henderson Inclusive School, which is in Dorchester. You got to be from here to say Dorchester. And he started the first urban inclusive school in the country back in the late 80s, which continues to be a model of inclusive education in the country. I've known Bill, as I said, since we worked in the Boston Public Schools together a long time ago. One of the nice things about having a friend who used to have sight and now is blind is that he remembers me with long brown hair. It's a great advantage. He talks about the blind advantage, I talk about the old advantage. Eric Shedd is one of my faculty colleagues here at Harvard. I was very fortunate to be on the search committee that brought Eric to Harvard. I could say a whole bunch of things about his work at Stanford, his work at Brown, and NYU. But mostly the way I'd like to describe Eric is he's a teacher's teacher. And he's heading up our teacher education program here, teacher residency program here at Harvard, that is taking talented young undergraduates at Harvard and will be molding them into great teachers like himself. Michael, would you like to introduce your folks?
Absolutely. From my right, your left, we have Michael Muehe, who is the Executive Director of the Cambridge Disability Commission, which doesn't describe everything that he does. Michael interacts with businesses and persons with disabilities and makes sure that businesses, sidewalks, environments, and other matters are accessible to people with disabilities, but also gets involved in local and national politics. For many years, he was at the Boston Center for Independent Living. You were up to your ears in the assisted suicide debate a few years ago, and other matters, and he's a great advocate and a terrific resource for those of us living in Cambridge with disabilities and those of us visiting. In the center, we have Dr. Cui Fengming. At the Harvard Project on Disability, we've worked in 40 countries, but probably our flagship country is China, and Dr. Cui is our China director. She will tell you about her personal experiences, but for mine, working with her in China and elsewhere, but working with her in China where she interacts with parent groups and children with disabilities and persons with disabilities, and really changes their attitudes about how they feel about their children, the prospects for life, getting them into schools, getting them into jobs, is just a marvelous, transformative thing to watch and to be a part of. So I'm very grateful to work with you. And sitting next to Professor Hehir is Cheri Blauwet, MD, 7-time medal winner from the Paralympics and just recently returned from Brazil because she's on the governing board. Cheri works very hard to change images of people with disability through sport, from one of not being able and on the sidelines to being empowered and mobile and active participants in sport and therefore in the rest of their lives as well. So she does terrific work, although we don't get to see her as much as we like.
So, Cheri, would you like to begin?
I would, sure.
Great.
Is this live? Okay, good. So, thank you for the invitation to join you. I think this is, just a really, really interesting and fantastic meeting of the minds from the standpoint of thinking about how we continue to empower people with disabilities in employment settings. So Michael introduced me to the group. So I currently am a practicing physician. I actually practice sports medicine at Spalding Rehab Hospital and the Brigham and Women's Hospital. And I initially moved to Boston in 2009 to do my medical residency here at Harvard Med School. So I wanted to talk about those two kind of dueling hats today. First off, my background in sports, but also my current work as a physician in an environment where people with disabilities are certainly underrepresented across the profession, to put it as a major understatement. So a couple points I wanted to touch on is taking it back. I actually was initially from a fairly rural area of the Midwest. I acquired a spinal cord injury when I was quite young. And because of that, really spent much of my childhood learning to keep up with others in the best way I could, but I wasn't necessarily a part of, I guess I would say because it was a rural community that inclusion just happened as a means of making things work. But I wasn't necessarily part of a strong disability community because I was certainly the only young person with a disability in my public school, thanks to the work of many people who came before me. I went through school in actually initially a pre-ADA world and then a post-ADA world as I moved along. And one of the things that was extremely empowering to me was encountering almost by mistake, sports opportunities. And I say that not because I went from, not being involved to being a Paralympian, but because initially it gave me opportunities to interact with other young people with disabilities of varied types. And that was really the first opportunity that gave me a sense of pride in being a person with a disability and brought me into the disability community, actually. So it was a very important shift in my young life. Because of sports, I went to the University of Arizona for undergraduate school and then ended up being interested in medicine and went to Stanford for medical school. So I was on the West Coast for a while. And thinking back on it, I recognized that as I was coming into higher education, I definitely was now part of that ADA generation in many ways because I had interest in healthcare sector. And largely because my parents were involved in it, so I always thought it would be a good idea. And when I went into and started undergrad, I knew I was interested in pre-med, and actually I had this sort of naive viewpoint of it, like, well, of course I can do that. Of course I'm going to move forward and apply to medical school. And interestingly, I never initially even thought about the fact that being a wheelchair user would prevent that or prohibit me from doing that. So I think that is sort of the epitome of the ADA generation of just assuming, of course, that these opportunities will be available. So as I went through, I was accepted and then matriculated into medical school. And it was then that I started to interface with different circumstances and different environments in which we had to really think about inclusion and think about access and reasonable accommodations. But I was very, very appreciative and very lucky in many ways because a lot of that was a conversation along the way rather than me feeling like I had to necessarily fight for it all the time. And I realized that was probably I was fortunate to be in that environment. Some of the things we used were, for example, I did use some accommodations in the standardized exams for the physical exam for our boards. I utilized a standing chair for my OR rotation to be in the operating room, and worked with our school to make all of those accommodations happen. As I was moving through and then moving towards a residency, I was also continuing to compete, and then I competed in my last Paralympic Games in Beijing in 2008. And I knew that I would miss sport if I wasn't involved in some way. So I decided to move forward with a residency and a career trying to really contribute to the world of physical activity in sports, but kind of with a new lens as a physician and healthcare provider, rather than as an athlete, knowing that I couldn't compete forever. And so that's the world that I'm largely in now, is continuing to work with the Paralympic movement to promote opportunities for inclusive sport, both at the grassroots level as well as at the competitive level. And as we move forward those opportunities, making sure that people with disabilities and athletes with disabilities are included in research, are included in clinical care paradigms that we would, roll out for any athletes. As well as working with our local programs to make sure that on the ground level we're getting people involved and having opportunities to live physically active lifestyles, which of course is important for everyone. I would say some of the more interesting things I'm involved with now are particularly looking at diversity in medicine. So for a long, long time, and still today, we do a lot of work on diversity, inclusion in healthcare and medicine, but disability is still often left out, very frequently, including here at Harvard. And so it's getting, we're making progress, but that's still something in which I feel like we have to be a proactive squeaky wheel on a lot of occasions. There's interesting day-to-day patient interactions. I continue to feel like that being a physician with a disability is a huge benefit to both me and my patients, because I think there's a inherent understanding of the fact that they may come to me experiencing a challenge, and their body might be, experiencing symptoms that are holding them back. But together we can usually find a way to get them back up on their feet and back into life and meeting their goals. From the standpoint of the Paralympic movement, a lot of what we're working on now is doing some epidemiological research where we're looking at the injuries that athletes experience as they move from the development level to the competitive level, so that we can implement injury prevention programs that keep people competing well into their adulthood and beyond, and that we make sure that safe sport opportunities stay safe and beneficial for everyone. So I think I'll stop there. It's a little bit about what I do.
Good.
Thank you.
Good to see you again. Todd.
So hi, everyone. My name is Todd Grindal, and as Dr. Hehir indicated, I do research, primarily research on how public policies shape the development of young children and students with disabilities. I've had the privilege of standing on this stage before to talk about the findings of my research, but never to talk about myself and my own personal experiences. It's a very different feeling. So I'll say a little about my experiences as a student, and then talk some more about what that has meant for me in the workplace. I'm dyslexic. And what that means is that I struggle with reading text, large amounts of text in particular, and with writing and spelling. I can read names and so on and get through small amounts of text, but when it comes to consuming paragraphs, pages, reports, it takes me both a very long time, and I struggle with comprehension from written text. 20 years ago, that was really a big problem, particularly in the industry that I'm in. I consume and produce research as part of my work. Today, not so much. There are tools that I can use that read the words on the screen for me and allow me to listen to them, and that allow me to produce written text by talking. But it wasn't always the case. So I grew up in Central Florida, a little town called Fruitville, Florida. And by second grade, it was clear that my progress through school looked a little different than my older brother and sister. I was really struggling with basic phonics, with reading, and it was manifesting itself in problematic behaviors in school. I can remember doing this. When it would become my turn to read the sentence, I would act out in some way, because in my peer group, it felt safer to be a bad kid than to be a kid who wasn't smart. My parents, very fortunately, had the resources to have me assessed, to understand what's going on. Why could his brother and sister read at this point, and why is he struggling? And through that assessment, determined pretty clearly that I fit this dyslexic profile. My parents, the message I think that happened then, I think is an important one. I was told to not tell anybody about this. Mm-hmm. Because, and I think their strategy was at the time in Central Florida a smart one. Disclosing that I was dyslexic would mean that I would be in a segregated placement. I would not have access to the general curriculum. I'd be subject to stigma about the types of things that I was capable of doing, and would have just different interactions with my peers. So I spent my school career hiding this in ways, and developed some kind of clever ways to do this. I've talked about this with Tom, and as he mentioned, I'm one of the people, I forget what my pseudonym is, but I'm one of the people in his book, and it's fine to know that. As I got to college, consuming large amounts of written text was a pretty important thing to do. I was very interested in history, and so there was quite a bit of text. And try as I might, no matter how much time I dedicated to it, I couldn't consume it. What I learned to do was to form study groups, particularly study groups with people I knew who would do the reading. And positioned myself as the value that I would add would be the one who could help to integrate your perspective and think about what this means for X, Y, and Z. Those were skills I had developed through school to help me to do well. But still, I was an undergrad in the days of blue books, and the comments I would get back on my work were consistently, there are some strong ideas here. I'm having trouble following your spelling and sentence structure. So again, a real challenge. Continued to not disclose this to people as I became a teacher and taught for a few years, and came here to Harvard to learn to be a better teacher. I enrolled in Dr. Hehir's course, and he talked about inclusion. He talked about accommodations in ways that I had no idea existed. I had no idea that a screen reader could help me to consume all of this text. I remember in my first semester going to Dr. Hehir's office, closing the door, and very quietly and nervously disclosing, so I'm a dyslexic too. And I think it was the first time that I had been out about that to someone in a position of power, to someone who I wanted to consider me to be smart. With encouragement from Dr. Hehir, I subsequently stayed on and did my doctoral work here, became more comfortable in disclosing that to faculty while I was here, with different degrees of success. Faculty would often say, oh, great, yep, thanks for telling me. What are the accommodations you need? And they would typically be, if there's going to be a written exercise during class, if I could have that digitally or have that ahead of time. I can participate in the same way. In-class exams will be challenging for me. Is there a way I can do that with using voice-to-text technology? Inevitably, they would forget. And an activity would come up in class where a large piece of text was provided and we were asked to interpret it. Others were case studies, things like that. Again and again, it would happen. So although I was open about it and would even say to faculty afterwards, hey, that doesn't work for me. Can we do this a different way? And people would try to adapt. Continued to struggle with that as a student. So when I finished here, I took a position as a senior researcher with Abt Associates. Abt Associates is a large contract research firm. We have offices here in Cambridge, Washington, D.C. and across the country. We do work focused on education, environment, food and nutrition, a range of work. Again, a similar environment where people value one another based on this idea that they have strong intelligence skills. It's good to be smart there. And so I arrived on day one and had my office-issued computer and noticed that I didn't have this software. So contacted the technical support folks and said, hey, can we put this software on your computer? Or can you put this on my computer? I need a screen reader and voice-to-text technology. The response I got back was, we'll need a note from your doctor. And I'll need your supervisor and the head of the division to approve this. So fortunately, my mother had actually saved the assessment, the typewritten assessment from, I think it was 1981, 1982.
You could have called me.
And I had it. I had it to show them. But it was the need to disclose that to these people I had just met, who I really wanted to impress that they had made a good choice in hiring me. And ultimately, I was able to do that, and they provided me the accommodations that I needed, but they weren't ready for me. And I think that's one of the things that I struggled with. That dyslexia is a fairly common learning disability. If you have, typically, if you've got an average-sized class of second or third graders, you're going to have at least one person with dyslexia. And certainly there had been people with dyslexia in my organization. It's a large organization before, but yet when I arrived, they had to retrofit everything. There was no procedure for how someone would disclose, for providing those types of accommodations. And to their credit, and in part this is what I had learned in this process of advocating for myself here as a student, I made that very clear to the HR department. Why the disclosure to my supervisor and the other people I worked with on the first day of work was not something I necessarily wanted to do. And they've been able to accommodate me and to set up systems for people coming forward. But it just hadn't been something that was on the HR or the IT radar screen. I'm happy to report today I've been there for 3 years, and now people come by my office and they see me talking to my computer and listening to things, and have seen other non-dyslexics, or at least not diagnosed dyslexics, say, hey, you know what, that would really help me. I think I could be more productive if I had these tools, and other people taking on these tools to make this a more normal, typical way that we work, that this falls within the range of how people do our work. So I think I'll leave it at that and look forward to the conversation.
Can I just add one thing?
Sure.
In that short time, you've had a major promotion, too.
Yeah, and done quite well, yeah.
Eric.
Well, I want to thank folks who've gone ahead of me. Those are really powerful stories, and I see so much of my story in in your stories as well. And what I really want to do is talk similarly about my journey to where I've gotten professionally and how that's sort of informed my work as a professional. I have dysgraphia, which is a form of dyslexia. It's much more about the writing than it is the reading. But I also have issues with information processing, so very slow, and executive functioning, and so, organization. I like to say that I can see the forest and I can see the leaf, but the tree I often miss. And so much of that became apparent to me only in my graduate studies as well when I was doing my doctoral work. But I'll start sort of with something going on right now, and then I'll kind of take you up to how I got here. And so in the next week or so, I'll be finishing up a report on a small grant that I was awarded through the Library of Congress to work with primary sources in local history. I'm very proud of that, but the major achievement for me was not finishing the grant or even winning the grant. It was applying for the grant. And I say that because when I started my career as a professor at Brown, I knew that I had issues with information processing and executive function, and it was going to be a lot to do my job as a teacher, as a program director, and any other kind of work on the side, which I desperately wanted to do because I had those interests. And so about the first month or two of being on the job, I go into the department chair's office, and I had sent him my evaluation ahead of time, which I highlight just a few things for folks and said, listen, I have some issues here in terms of the way in which I work, and I need some support. And he said, Eric, well, what do you need? And I said, I would love to work with the person who's TAing for me. She's really bright, thoughtful, organized, and I think if I could hire her for a little extra work, I think we could do some really great things. The chair was very accommodating, provided me with a small amount of funds, and together, along with the student, we were able to apply for this grant, win this grant, and then she actually helped me run the grant. Grateful for that. And so what allowed me to do that was two things. One is sort of the actual document that said I had some learning disabilities, but also understanding myself and what I needed. And it wasn't like I was just going to show up at the job and say I have these issues, and they'll say, well, here's all these great things that you need. I really had to sort of define that in some part for myself. And so what allowed me to do that was really the work that I did as a Stanford graduate student, working with, I guess, the equivalent of Eileen's office at Stanford, where they provided support for students with special needs. So how did I get there? Just briefly, when I was very young, second or third grade, the dysgraphia was quite apparent, with the B's and the D's and the 2s and the 6s. That became quite apparent. My father was a psychologist. I went to a very good elementary school, so folks were in the know. It was quickly identified. I think I received support for about a year to fix those numbers. And then that was it, from about the age of 8 to 33. That was the only support that I provided. And what had happened is the issues with the executive functioning and the information processing never went detected, largely because I was a smart kid that worked hard. And so I would stay up till 12 o'clock reading, 5 or 6 pages on a textbook. I knew it really well, aced the test, and so nobody necessarily saw the issues were there. What happened is by the time I got to Stanford as a graduate student, everybody was really, really, really smart. Everybody worked really, really, really hard. And so those two advantages I had that had gotten me through were sort of what was expected. Mm-hmm. And so I remember, struggling a lot, and the tipping point happened in my second year at Stanford, where my book bag was stolen. And at the time, I had my laptop, my thumb drives, my little handwritten reports. Not the best sort of strategy there, but I had everything in that bag, and so I basically lost my first 2 years of graduate school or doctoral school. And so I had my first sort of qualifying paper was gone. All my work for that semester was gone. And so, of course, professors were very understanding, and my advisor was very understanding. But fast forward a year later, I had submitted my proposal, but my advisor said, Eric, what's going on with these other courses? Like, you have incompletes for a year. These are about to turn into Fs. You got to finish them up. And that really sort of heightened the stress for me. It just wasn't even on my mind. I was just working on my qualifying exam, thinking that in my regular courses, and I kind of almost had forgotten about the other papers that I owed. And when that reality that I had to make up basically like 3 classes, do my current work as well as my research, it just was overwhelming. What was also happening at the same time is that I was interested in doing my own research around struggling readers and how we can use film to help struggling readers read. And so I was beginning to understand some of the cognitive processes that went into reading, along with the fact that I was TAing for a teaching students with special needs course. And so I was really sort of immersed in that literature. And I kept saying to my fellow TA, I was like, man, I see myself when I'm reading this. And she was like, yeah, me too. And I kind of was like, well, do I really have something else going on in this dysgraphia? And I wasn't certain. But that was a real tipping point when I had all these papers to make up. And so basically, I go into my advisor's office one day, and I break down in tears, and I kind of say to myself, I don't read like everybody else. I don't think like everybody else. I don't know what it is, but I know that something's not, something's not jiving with the way that this school situation is working for me. And my advisor was very understanding, but he's like, so what should we do? And I was like, I think I need to get evaluated. And so I had the opportunity to do, interestingly enough, though, in terms of, privilege and access, is that it was $3,000 to get an evaluation. It was not covered by the school. Fortunately, I was very savvy in terms of the system and could I classify it as sort of a medical sort of need, and they had funds for medical sort of procedures or medical support, and so I was able to get this evaluation. And when I got the evaluation back, I was shocked. I was both sort of empowered and terrified all at the same time, because I'm looking at these numbers and it's, it's breaking down the domains of your IQ, and I'm seeing 90s percentile, 90th percentile, 16th percentile. Wow. I'm looking at reading comprehension. It's a reading comprehension, 18%. That doesn't sound right. I'm at Stanford. How did I get here, Reading rate, 12th percentile. Wow. Reading comprehension on unlimited test, 99th percentile. Okay, I get it. Okay, I need time to work. And so armed with both the what I call the official sort of legal support to say, listen, this is what I deserve, along with the sort of the knowledge of myself and beginning to understand that I'm not lazy, that I'm not distracted, that I'm not disorganized because I'm bad. Armed with that sort of beginning to understand myself and knowing what was legally right, I was able to begin to advocate for myself and get the things that I need. So real quickly, I'd say in the last couple of minutes, one thing that I immediately did was said that I need time. I need time to work. And so I went to my advisor and said, there is a great fellowship that will relieve me of all my research duties for 2 years and allow me to focus on my dissertation. It's a 5-page application. You know what I need? I need 2 months to write this application. And that's what it took me, to write multiple versions, to kind of think about what it is that I need to present. And he kind of gave me that time off where we kind of eased off on some of my other responsibilities and allowed me to write that. I was able to get this fellowship, which is around diversifying academia. And so I'm honored to be here, I think, in one respect, in diversifying academia as somebody with learning disabilities. And that really allowed me to write my dissertation. It kind of freed me up and gave me the time. Fast forward to Brown. I got to Brown and said, what do I need? I need a student to help me do some writing. And so really it was just through understanding of yourself that it really allowed me to do sort of my 4 takeaways would be, when you understand yourself, you begin to advocate for yourself. You can be kind to yourself. You can celebrate yourself. And you can also push yourself. And I think that's where I'm at right now in this new position, where I have the access to all these resources, but I have a new job. We're running a startup program that started very quickly, and so there's all sorts of challenges. So I have a ton of resources. Folks at Eileen's office, I see Jenny over there, who was a tremendous help to me earlier, have been really wonderful, but this is a new territory for me, and so really trying to sort of understand and push myself is kind of where I'm at still in this work.
Thank you. Dr. Fengming.
It's nice to be here and to share. I came to the United States from China in 2003 for my doctoral program in special education at BU. And after I finished my program, I began to work for Harvard Law School project on disability from 2008. So today's story is not totally about myself. It's about the stories through our project in China, our peers in China, and some wonderful persons with disabilities. I think it will give us a picture of the major issues persons with disabilities encounter, like, globally. I totally agree with Professor Hehir, and when he mentioned earlier today that the ableism, the issue, and I want to focus my story on the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 8. It's raising awareness of their abilities of persons with disabilities. And because this is such one of the major issues, disability rights movement have to deal with in all different countries. So like in China, this ableism influences program design for higher education and career development for persons with disabilities. So through our work, we work with a group of people with vision impairments. So right now, they all work for probably the top disabled persons organization in China, and they do advocacy skills. They have wonderful trainers. And our project started from Train the Trainers program for persons with disabilities in China, and they are representative organizations. And so this group started from a small radio program. They are blind journalists. The only purpose they want to start the radio program is to show society they can do something else in addition to massage. As many of you probably know, persons with vision impairments are limited to massage. That's related to policy making for vocational training programs, job design and arrangements. So it created this systematic barrier for persons with vision impairments specifically, but also it has other implications to persons with other disabilities. So this group of young men started this radio program and wanted to show other parts of the society they can do something else. Many of them came from training programs for massage. Some of them came all the way from School for the Blind, and some of them finished their middle school but went into training programs, vocational training programs for vision impairments. And they all did massage jobs. And then when they started this job, they began to create all kinds of programs that help persons with disabilities to function and to show their abilities in different job settings. And some of them became, we call them like train the trainers program, and they became trainers. And I'm so proud to say that a few of them not only are trainers in their own communities, they are trainers for parents and also experts in China for disability rights. We bring them to the classes. And so one of them came 1 year to attend a conference in UN, and then he came to Boston to visit some of the programs over here. So I took him to Perkins. We had a very nice conversation with Perkins people, and some of them just work on the US part. Some of them work in Asian countries, so they have a broader view of what things is like in other countries. So when this folk shared the experience of persons with disabilities in China and the massage work they had to do, if they go out to find other jobs and they will get things like this, oh, like you are blind, you really should go to do massage rather than coming here to apply for a job. So he was sharing about that, and one of the folks at Perkins said, I think it's great to do massage. So what's the problem with that? Another colleague who had experience working in Asia said, it's great if it's one of your options, if you are interested in it, but it's not great when that's the only option you are forced to choose. And this is exactly the situation in China. So that that person began to understand so the experience of persons with disabilities in China. And this organization created, in addition to their other work promoting disability rights in China, and they are involved in writing handbooks with us on different topics like disability rights for persons with vision impairments, narratives of persons with disabilities, and the narratives of persons with disabilities in different work settings, which are already finished and are distributed widely in China in different formats, and also including accessible formats. And one of the programs they have is the calling center. So they have trainers to train persons with disabilities to have skills to make phone calls, receive phone calls, so that they can find jobs in sales companies, right? So to make phone calls. And one of the girls, her story is featured in our narratives. And she had a terrible experience in doing massage in different places, sexually abused. She didn't like the job. She was affected physically. And all of a sudden, she found this training opportunity at this call center. So she came and escaped from those massage places and received the training. And So now is working for an insurance company to make phone calls. And so through the process, the center of the work of this organization is to promote disability rights. So they are involved in legal reform too. And for persons with disabilities, they had limited opportunities in getting into inclusive colleges and universities in China. And if for persons with vision impairments, if they were able to go, they had to go to massage training programs, and no matter what their abilities and gifts are. But from last year, a new policy came out. I think disability organizations contributed a lot through our advisory support to make this policy happen. So that students with disabilities can take the national entrance examination to go to regular college. According to the news, 5,000 persons with disabilities got accepted by regular colleges and universities. And so we're designing programs to train them as disability rights champions in the future. And also, they began to think about, right after they got into these programs, they began to think about what kind of jobs they are going to do. The situation is because of the low awareness of the ability of persons with disabilities, in spite of their college degree, they probably will have a hard time to find the job they really like. They're gifted for, they have ability to do, but they probably will get a job. In China, employment, they use the quota system, meaning employers will get financial penalty if they don't hire a person with disabilities according to the law. And can you guess like what the percentage is? 1.5. So if you have 100 employees in your workplace, you only need to hire 1/2 person with disabilities, and the penalty has been increasing. What does that tell us, right? So it's very clear. And so Professor Hehir also talked about the ability of those persons with disabilities in understanding their disability and their environment, and really focus on problem solving. And I totally agree with him, and also what Professor Stein said, this is not a charity issue. This is a self-interest issue. I think it will take a long time for us. It's a long journey for the world to understand why it's a self-interest issue. When I'm not disabled, I don't have a sibling with disabilities or a friend with a disability, and I think it takes time for it, because problem solving, understanding like who you are, what your environment is a huge gift and talent for everyone, no matter you have a disability or not. So our program is really targeting that goal. We do programming and we design it. It's embedded in all our program components in China and elsewhere in the world. And so one last word I want to say is that the contribution of this group leaders, disability group leaders, and their contribution to China and help China to understand it's wrong to create a segregated system for persons with disabilities is significant. So parents, under their support and also the support from international communities, are making great efforts in China. There's a huge gap between the law in paper and implementation. There's still a lot to do, and so I'm really grateful for this opportunity to use my personal experience and my knowledge and skills from trained programs for this work. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Dr. Henderson.
So I started teaching as a sighted teacher in the 70s, and in fact, one of my outstanding students, who I haven't met in over 30 years, said, Dilma, wave your arm. I met her again today. She's promoting diversity at Boston College. But I quickly confronted disability and unemployment unexpectedly, as I started losing my vision, and an eye specialist who had been trained at Harvard told me I needed to get out of education because I was going to go blind, and the deputy superintendent told me not to worry because I qualified for disability retirement. And then in the mid and late 80s, I met parents who were getting similar messages of exclusion. Their kids with disabilities like cerebral palsy, autism, Down syndrome, and significant disabilities said no room at the inn in any Boston public school, which had 12,000 kids with disabilities, no room at the inn to be included, even though they knew in their gut if they were going to prepare their young children to live, work, and spend leisure time in integrated communities, it makes sense to start inclusion when you're young. And so and then I became principal of the school. And what I'd like to share my remarks about what we in universities and K-12 can do to better prepare those who don't have disabilities, and what we can also do to better prepare those who have disabilities for work. Because employment of persons with disabilities depends on both the skills of those of us who have disabilities and the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors of those without. So in terms of universities and K-12, I want to start out, we need to infuse disability awareness. So when we're teaching about government, like at the Kennedy School of Government, and I know people are trying to make curriculum more multicultural, more diversity, we have to do what Michael Stein says, include the D word. So consciously we need to say that, hey guys, FDR was a president, he was in a wheelchair, he tried to hide it, but it is who he was, and this is part of his, and why did he have to hide it? And Nelson Rockefeller couldn't decode the word Constitution, and these are some things he had to do to hide it in his speeches, and talk about their contributions. And we can go to any academic field, literature, science, physics, whatever it is. In literature, James Joyce with his disability, Patricia Polacco, a famous children's author. Let the kids know she couldn't spell. She struggled with reading and writing. And Lederick Horn, and I mention him because he has spoken here at Harvard, and he came and spoke to my school. And after he did, a man who had some significant dyslexia, some emotional impairments, but is also a poet, a playwright, hip-hop singer, and a builder. And after my kids saw him, I had kids 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and 5th graders saying, I'm like Lederick. They went back to their classes. I'm like Lederick. And this is how we help get it out of the closet. It just doesn't happen. There is still a lot of shame with disability, particularly with hidden disabilities, and so we have to bring it into our curriculum and celebrate it. There needs to be more inclusion. It's starting, it's happening, but it's still totally disjointed and fragmented in this country, and despite the fact that our president and Arne Duncan have said that every kid with a disability deserves the right to start out an inclusive classroom, huge numbers don't, and we have huge biases in how this is happening. I mean, shame on all of us who live in Massachusetts that if you have a disability and you're a kid and you come from lower socioeconomic background, you're twice as likely to be assigned and kept in substantially separate classrooms. Where's the outrage? And that there are racial biases with opportunity, starting out when kids are 3, 4, and 5. You know, African American, Latino kids, more assigned and kept in substantially separate classrooms, assigned that way by professionals who've gone to universities, who either aren't PC about inclusion, although everybody says they're PC about inclusion, but they have a perverted PC because they're not, it's not professionally convenient. And then what about employment at the university? Yes, hiring people. Professors are going to be people who are intellectually advanced, but you know, if DuPont can hire adults with intellectual disabilities because the CEO had a kid with Down syndrome to help support their physics and chemistry labs, could we not have people with intellectual disabilities supporting your physics and chemistry teachers here at Harvard? If Walgreens, which won an award for hiring a lot of people on the spectrum with developmental issues and having an excellent distribution center cannot at Harvard and our public schools hire some people on the spectrum with developmental delays in our distribution work and throughout all aspects of, we who are promoting inclusion in our institutions, state, public, and universities, have to do a better job of hiring. For the kids, I want to say I was shocked a year ago. Carl Richardson, a state leader in disability, wave your hand, Carl. He invited me to go to an attorney general meeting discussing disabilities, and they talked about employment, bemoaning the fact that kids with disabilities are not getting the same opportunities for employment and summer work internships, and they talked about kids from a particular school. I said, wait a minute, I know that school. 70% of the kids at that school have an IEP. I bet you they all had disabilities. And in fact, some of you said, yes, all those kids in that summer internship program had dyslexia or emotional impairments or very mild cognitive delays, but none of them identified as having a disability. This is also warping our statistics. I think the employment situation is bad. It's not as bad as it is because those of us with visible disabilities are out there, but people without the visible are hidden. The kids themselves they don't want to say they're disabled. So, we are pampering them in schools too much with one-on-one paras, with lowered expectations. The student Tom Hehir, who'd always had reduced workloads. There's no reason why anybody with dyslexia is not working at the same quantity of work with the technology that's available. And if we start this when they're in second, third, fourth grade and build up that capacity for success. 6 minutes. I'm going to watch it. Thank you for the time. And I have a talking watch, but it's intrusive, all right? And so we have to push these kids more, and we also have to connect them with groups of people who have similar disabilities. And I'm amazed at how many young people don't know their history and the struggle for civil rights. And so we need to be teaching this in our civil rights and our history classes with kids in schools and at universities. And we have two blind leaders here, and Kyle Scheckman with the National Federation and Carl Richardson with the American. They're all groups of people in wheelchairs and autism. Jonathan Moody, a leader from Brown University, and a group Eye to Eye for people with dyslexia, now LaDerrick Horn. We need to connect these young people and their families, starting out when they're developing a consciousness at 4th, 5th, 6th grade, and certainly in universities with these other. They don't have to join anybody. They need to go to some conventions, see what's happening, so they can develop the advocacy skills. Because I know too many kids that are going to college. And they go into a class, and they have a professor who has the negative beliefs, attitudes about including disabilities, and they don't have a para or mommy there to advocate for them, and they're failing. And in Boston, 60% of the kids in juvenile lockup have learning disabilities. That's not their failure. It's all of ours who are preparing the next generation of students and teachers and doctors and lawyers. All of us need to be more inclusive if there's going to be more employment and success. That's it.
Michael.
So I'm the one. Does this work? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm the person on the stage probably least able to hold a handheld mic. So I'm going to ask my friend Bill here, since I accommodated him, he's going to accommodate me.
Where do I hold it?
Just hold it a little closer. Right there is good.
Good.
I'm happy to do it.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, this is BS, blind support. There you go.
BS. All right.
If people don't help me, I tell them they don't have enough BS. That's blind sensitivity.
Michael, you prefer this one?
No, actually, I like the idea of the BS. I like the BS.
Yeah.
Believe me, I know Bill's BS.
I didn't know you couldn't hold this.
So it's really an honor to be here with such distinguished panel, and I appreciate the opportunity to share with you a little bit about how I got here, my own personal narrative. Back in the autumn of 1976, I was a freshman in college when one day I fell off my dormitory roof and broke my neck. Consequently, I sustained a spinal cord injury, and I have been using a wheelchair for my mobility ever since. After my accident, I spent 6 months in rehab at the Boston University Medical Center. and less than a year later, I resumed my college education. Now, like many people who experienced a traumatic injury, I went through several years learning to adjust to living with a disability. There's a lot of confusion and isolation, and I tried as many different ways as I could to combat the isolation and confusion that I was feeling with this new role that I was thrust into. But over the next 5 years or so after my injury, I experienced several events. You might call them transformative experiences. One of these was the time that I found myself in the student union building at BU, passing by an open room from which I heard some loud, angry voices. So I was wondering what was going on, so I stuck my head in the door, only to see, to my surprise, there was a bunch of people with various disabilities, including some people who were blind and some people with mobility disabilities, confronting some MBTA bureaucrats for not making their buses and trains and the system more accessible to riders with disabilities. Now, as a student at BU, I often had the experience of wheeling my chair up and down Commonwealth Avenue, and when it started to rain or snow, some of my non-disabled classmates would quickly jump on the nearest Green Line trolley when that happened to avoid the inclement weather. But that was not an option for me because, guess what? The trolleys weren't wheelchair accessible. So, when I heard these angry voices talking about how can we make the MBTA more accessible, I thought to myself, this is really something I could sink my teeth into. It was truly an empowering experience to learn that there were other people with disabilities daring to take on the massive MBTA bureaucracy. So this is the beginning of my advocacy career. A couple of years later, in 1981, I had another transformative experience. I joined a very interesting class at a place called the Boston Self-Help Center. Actually, the class was really a structured support group for people with various disabilities. One of the group leaders, an amazing woman named Marcia Saxton, started talking about the oppression and discrimination that society directed constantly at people with disabilities. And she talked about how, like other disenfranchised groups, like people of color, like women, and like LGBTQ people, she talked about how we could learn to fight that discrimination by working together. She talked about how, in the face of that discrimination, that onslaught, we often internalize that oppression that society directs at us, much to our detriment. And she taught us how learning to recognize that internalized oppression is the first step toward eliminating it. It was such a powerful concept for me. It was one of the major factors that led me to furthering a career in disability rights advocacy. After Marcia's class, I got my first real job working at the Boston Center for Independent Living, and I got my first taste of doing real advocacy as part of a nationwide cross-disability independent living movement. We were fighting together for the rights of people with disabilities, the right to live independently in the community, the right to have accessible housing and transportation, the right to have employment opportunity, meaningful employment opportunity, the right for a comprehensive education, and the right to get government funding for the services and support we needed to make our independent living goals a reality. I share these experiences with you because I truly believe that change happens at a local level, as well as at a national level. But working locally, working to inform and educate can have a profound impact at the local level and beyond the city limits. The power to adapt exists in every human being. People with disabilities have been forced to maximize their adaptive skills and strategies just to survive. Also, we've learned to maximize our capacity to build relationships, both with other people with disabilities and with non-disabled people, and to cultivate alliances with others to make our efforts stronger. Now, in the area of employment and education, in full participation society, people with disabilities still face many barriers. Statistics from the U.S. Census Bureau consistently demonstrate that depending on the region of the country, people with disabilities are still 2 to 3 times more likely to be living in poverty than non-disabled people. In my 20-plus years working for the City of Cambridge as Director of the Disabilities Commission, I witnessed tremendous improvements in the accessibility landscape, both for people with disabilities in the workplace and for the general disability population. Among the most impressive gains we have seen is a true embracing of the concept that workers with disabilities must be an essential part of any workforce diversity efforts. While we still have a long way to go before this dream is fully realized as a reality, managers and supervisors in all levels of our organization have come to recognize that just as hiring, retaining, and promoting people of color, women, and members of the LGBT community are keys to creating a truly diverse and dynamic workforce, workers with disabilities must also be part of this equation. I've also witnessed many good examples of technology being used to improve accessibility and employment opportunity for our residents with disabilities. And I think I'm going to be skipping this and going on to my closing remarks. I know we have limited time here. Thanks, Mike.
He's not asking me to read it for him.
Okay. In closing, I'd just like to share some thoughts regarding technology and neurodiversity. I just finished reading a wonderful book by Steve Silberman. Highly recommended to all of you. The book is called Neurotribes: The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity. Before reading this book, I thought I knew a lot about people on the autism spectrum, but it made me realize just how little I actually do know. While the book Neurotribes is nominally a history of autism, albeit in a very compelling and highly accessible narrative style, it is much more than that. Among its many powerful insights, this book is full of illuminating stories about the intersection of disability and technology. Just to cite one example, the author recounts a conversation he had with a supervisor at Microsoft who said, "All my top debuggers have Asperger's syndrome. They can hold hundreds of lines of programming code in their head as a visual image. They look for the flaws in the pattern, and that's where the bugs are." But among the most important takeaways from Neurotribes is the idea that in this ever-increasingly globally interconnected world, we simply cannot afford anymore to leave anyone behind, regardless of what their disability may be. All people on the autism spectrum, indeed all people with disabilities, have something meaningful to contribute to our society if just given the chance. This especially applies to people who just don't seem to fit into standard social norms and standard social expectations. As Steve Silberman put it, many of the challenges people on the autism spectrum face daily are not symptoms of their autism, but hardships imposed by a society that refuses to make basic accommodations for people with disabilities. Silberman's book poses the questions: what if we were to actually give everyone a chance to apply their unique skills and attributes? What if we were to actually give everyone a chance to contribute in a way that is meaningful? What if we were to actually give everyone a chance to work with the necessary accommodations they need? Just imagine how much better off our society would be. Just imagine how much better off our nation would be. Just imagine how better off our world would be. Thank you.
Professor Stein?
Do we have time for questions, Eileen?
15 minutes.
Yeah, let's take questions.
Yeah. Do you have any question of the panel, Professor Stein? I'm going to get that for you.
Well, I think our audience has been sitting patiently and listening, and I'd much rather get questions from them. Can we take a few questions?
Hi, my name is Karen Millett. I'm an accessibility consultant here at the university and sit within University Disability Services. You've all spoken about your various journey and your various experience in the employment setting. What would be the one initiative that you would make within your employer setting that would finally make that movement to include disability as part of diversity inclusion?
We go from one side of the panel onwards, and my quick answer is it's called accountability. So in every study and in every workplace that I've ever looked at or engaged with, every CEO will say they want to include people with disabilities. None will get up there and say, don't want them, trouble, problem.
That's right.
But something happens somewhere along the lines in the hiring. Every time the CEO tells the human resource people, this is really important to me, and 6 months from now we're going to sit down and see what the numbers look like and how we've improved, we see improvement. Every time the CEO says, this is important to me, and there's no accountability or follow-up, there's no improvement. And I don't find that to be a coincidence.
Off the top of my head, I would say that employers need to be encouraged to make a commitment to affirmative action. I know that's kind of a dirty word or maybe a passé phrase these days, but making hiring and promoting people with disabilities part of a real solid affirmative action plan, diversity plan. You still have your mic.
So I'm going to just talk. Thank you. You know, in a book that Tom wrote about effective inclusive schools, he talked about how the schools have to become professional learning communities, problem-solving communities. And some accommodations are simple and fairly obvious, but like getting up here on stage and being able to talk. But some of them are much more complex, particularly people with emotional impairments and dysgraphia and also, you know, executive functioning and intellectual impairments. So, and we don't always know. So it's having this openness for this. We're committed to figuring it out. We're going to involve the person who has a disability. We're going to involve the coworkers. Might have some good ideas. We might get some specialists in, but we're going to do whatever we can to make it work. That willingness and commitment to figure it out, and then find that expertise and try it out. It may work. We may need to try and do something different.
I would emphasize the leading role of persons with disabilities or employees with disabilities in the decision-making process, related decision-making process, and I think at least has like two sides benefit. For employers, they will understand the needs of persons with disabilities, and for employees with disabilities, they are actually on top of their abilities, their needs. They need to study and they need to make progress. So this is an empowerment like process, and also put disability in employment in like in the overall employment process, so help other employees without disabilities to think about what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and this is an open and welcoming environment for everyone else to contribute their best to the working environment, and also respect human beings' weaknesses and other issues.
I'll try to provide two quick thoughts. One would be, I think that there's a challenge in putting, any aspect of diversity, race, disability, gender, solely under the umbrella of diversity, because it gets so crowded that there's rarely time to give any, due attention to any one specific issue. So finding a place in a home along with diversity to think around issues of disability, I think, is key. An idea that I had about a year ago coming to Harvard, when I got here, they did this sort of ergonomic sort of intro to you. And so, they gave me a chair and said, is this the right height? And it was like, wow, this is great. This is unbelievable. And I always thought, is there some sort of like learning and thinking and processing ergonomics onboarding that you could do for folks, so when you get into a job, you're not only sort of figuring this stuff out yourself, but someone's sitting down and saying, what are the things that are presented with you? What are the things that you struggle with? And the same way, does this chair fit? Does this work day fit for you? And how can you do that?
My organization, I think like many large global companies, spends a lot of energy talking about our core values and how our work aligns with our core values. So among them are, we're a research organization, high levels of technical skill, collaboration. When we have a change in our employee evaluation system, we look to those core values. When we are in the hiring practice, we look to those core values. We're currently getting new space, new office space. Those core values are the first thing we talk about. Disability and inclusion is not part of those core values. And it comes up, and I'll mention the space issue. We're working with an architect who showed us a range of photos of people using what the new space might look like. None of those photos featured people with a visible disability. I raised this with the architects and the folks who were collaborating with them, and the response was, we'll be ADA compliant. Because it's not something that is at the forefront of our mind. And what happens there are little advocates in organizations that push it. But I think it would be something for my organization and similar organizations to consider adopting this as part of who we are. We are diverse, we are inclusive.
Awesome. And to round it out, I think I would bring it back to, so I'll speak briefly from my lens of working in healthcare, although I would say that I think this message applies to any highly competitive field where you have ambitious people all seeking to sort of, work in one place. And I would bring it back to the concept of universal design. So, there's a lot of people who talk about medical school. The AAMC talks about increasing diversity at the training level, and we know that currently less than 1% of matriculated medical students are people with disabilities or that self-identify as having disabilities. But we've never asked about current practitioners, all of those years that you work through your profession as a healthcare provider. And I think a part of that is because we have not, we haven't brought it out of the closet to think about disability as a ubiquitous life experience. So in many ways, we haven't even wrapped our heads around how do we define it. I mean, how many physicians do you see out there who are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who are definitely people with disabilities, but they would never consider themselves to be one? So I think it's about bringing the conversation out of the closet and then thinking about our environments from that lens of universal design. We talk a lot about it for people who come for care, for patients, if you want to use that word, but that those same concepts of universal design would be just as applicable and useful for the providers themselves if they only would accept the fact that maybe they are people with disabilities too.
I would second everything that's been said. You can have your phone. Thanks. But I think one of the things we look at this employment issue, not to neglect, is the needs for people with intellectual disabilities. Because so often we think about disability issues, the voice is folks like the folks we have up here. But I think we know, for instance, that the vast majority of people with intellectual disabilities, and intellectual disabilities are also common. It's about 1 in 100 people have a moderate to significant intellectual disability. That's a lot. 1% of a population is a lot of people. That we know that people with intellectual disabilities can work, but we also know that people with intellectual disabilities lose employment easily. And it's because employment is constantly changing. And so I remember this was kids that I was working with years ago who had intellectual disabilities, and they had jobs at Logan Airport working and preparing food for the airlines and so forth. There was a group of kids from one of the high schools in Boston, and they sent out an email saying that the code had changed for the security entrance into the facility. We got a call, and they were from Logan. Where are the kids who were learning to work? These are high school age kids with intellectual disabilities. And the kids were all standing outside the gate. And these, again, everybody else had gotten the email. Everybody else knew how to use the code. And so thinking, and I think we really have to think about this more, about how we systematize job supports in a world in which jobs change fairly frequently, so that people with intellectual disabilities don't go from employment to Social Security with, sitting at home. Not that they shouldn't get Social Security, but sitting at home without employment. And I think there are some things that are happening with, for instance, the Social Security PASS programs that enable people to use their benefit to support themselves at work. But too often, this large group of people with disabilities may start out in employment, but then leave employment and never go back in. And I think that that's something we have to be thinking about, the systems that we don't have for these folks.
Just one quick comment on everything that I just heard, and it's a terrific panel, and thank you. My name is Chuck Curdy, and I'm the HR director at Radcliffe, and you've raised so many important critical issues, but I'd like to just quickly comment on three. First of all, the comment that when the CEO is involved, it makes a huge difference. At Radcliffe, the Dean, Elizabeth Cohn, and the Executive Dean, Nisha Mangia, these issues are non-negotiable for those two women. And it has made a huge difference at Radcliffe in the way we behave, in the internships that we've created with the Perkins School and in the other work that we do throughout the year. Second, when you talked about the onboarding of an individual, when a new hire, when we offer a position to someone and they accept, one of the first things that we say to them is, what are all or any of the things that we can do and should do to make your transition as smooth and as successful as possible? Are there any accommodations you need? Is there any sort of training you would like as soon as you come in? It could be anything from a screen reader to ergonomic accommodation to an Excel class. And we don't know what that is, but we do that before they even start, so that the morning they walk into our school, we are prepared to provide them for success. Thank you.
Hello, thanks to each of you for sharing your stories. My question is, what can universities do to support students with disabilities become more metacognitive and more strategic? So in the sense of knowing what action to take, or this theme of problem solving has been coming up, so I'm just kind of curious about your thoughts on how to increase that ability. Thank you.
I think that the first thing I'd offer is that for many of those students, if they've made it to the university, they have things to teach us, right? Because they have had to problem solve. They've had to understand themselves as a learner in order to be able to get there. I think that's one of the themes that comes out of your book about students with disabilities at Harvard, that there is that self-awareness. So I think it's important to not assume that folks don't have those skills, and in many ways I think we could be learning from them, would be where I would start.
Okay, we'd like to wind up. We're getting ready for lunch. Thank you all for coming, and thank this wonderful panel.
So Michael, I'm going to try and get that book. Steve Silverman.
All our panelists are local, and we hope to have them join us in the future for a continuation of this incredible dialogue that we've started today. I'd like to, again, thank all of you, and thank Tom Hehir and Michael Stein for their amazing work. And I will now invite all of you to pick yourselves up and walk back across the street. We have a picnic bag lunch for you. And if you would bring that to your table, we're going to start our afternoon at 1 o'clock with Carol Glazer's keynote address, and to end the day with Jonathan Lazar's talk on accessible technology. And at that point, our universal design class will be joining us at 2:30. So we invite you all to lunch. Thank you.